So let's say you want to get into retro Yu-Gi-Oh! And specifically, you're interested in the early GX era. You got a lot of fond memories of that time. Maybe you played around GOAT, maybe you played it right after, but you've been playing GOAT for a bit and you want to see what actually comes later, Where did the game go from there? And you want to dive into a retro format, maybe find something that you enjoy. But after a little bit of research there, looking into what the retro scene has done in these formats, you find out that a lot of them are dominated by this one card, Cyber-Stein. And the reason they're dominated by this is because after Cybernetic Revolution came out, right after GOAT format, it released two powerful fusion monsters that you can pair with Stein. It released Cyber End Dragon and Cyber Twin Dragon, both of which can lead to big OTKs, because you're able to get out a Cyber Twin Dragon that's 5,600 damage direct if you clear away your opponent's monsters, and if you pair it in a popular Monarch strategy, 2,400 plus 5,600 is 8,000 exactly. If you don't want to go for the Cyber Twin route, maybe you've chipped down your opponent a little bit before that, you've got Cyber End Dragon, which can beat over your opponent's defense position monster with 4,000 attack. That is huge. So the Cyber-Stein OTK strategy is very, very popular in those formats and very, very good in those formats. And a lot of them are dominated by this one combo. But there were 4 full formats that people officially recognize looking back at the game's history around this time as distinct things that people actually play nowadays. And they all have Stein in them. So you might be wondering, what is the difference between these formats? Which one would I prefer? Because probably you don't want to play all of them to find out. I did play all of them to find out. So, this video is sort of the synthesis of my experiences in these formats. And hopefully it can help you determine which of these Stein OTK formats you'd prefer. Because while some people may like all of them, some people might only want to play one format with Stein OTK in it and leave it at that. And I perfectly understand that because the combo can be a bit degenerate. Now, part of the reason I think the combo is so degenerate is because it can slot into a lot of different decks. People view these formats as like, oh, a Stein OTK deck is really dominating the format. But I think the issue with Stein and the problematic part of Stein is not that, there's one singular deck that is playing Stein. There is a more all-in version of that Stein OTK deck you can play if you want to. But the fact that you can slot Stein into so many different decks and just have it as basically an instant win button if you fulfill some sort of conditions, then and you don't really have to play the rest of the game. You just win on the spot. That is very frustrating for a lot of people. And that's why a lot of people don't like this era of the game. But, there are differences between these different formats. And I think that some people would prefer some over others. So if you just want to dip your toe into this time, hopefully this video will help you figure out which format you actually want to play around with and experiment with and see if you actually enjoy it. So the first format we got to talk about here is Cyber format, which is the format held around SJC Boston in September 2005. Now, this used the same ban list as GOAT format, April 2005, but it does take place after Cybernetic Revolution was released, which includes things like Cyber Dragon and a variety of other cards, including the Cyber Dragon fusion monsters that make Stein so broken. Cyber-Stein is in GOAT format, but because you don't have the Cyber Fusion monsters here, it's a lot worse, and that makes it acceptable in GOAT format. But once Cyber format rolls around, now you have Stein running around and things get a bit degenerate. Of course, there are some other fun cards in that format too. Xarian Universe, which was sort of a flash pan for GOAT debate back in the early days. This card is legal in Cyber format, and it is fun. Some decks do play it, and it's a pretty cool card overall. But one of the big sticking points for this format for a lot of people is that, it shares the GOAT ban list. And a lot of people don't like the Trinity, Pot of Greed, Graceful Charity, Delinquent Duo, along with BLS in the format as well. So, if you like GOAT, but you don't necessarily like the ban list in GOAT, which it does apply to a lot of players. A lot of people love GOAT format, but they really don't like seeing the Trinity pop up in all those games. Then this format might not be for you. But if you do like GOAT format and you actually happen to like the list that is in GOAT, or you're just used to the power cards and are like, I don't really care if I get Trinity and stuff, then this format might be the one for you. I will say, in the past tournament results that we've had in this format, Stein OTK or decks playing it like Stein Monarch have been very good and have won multiple times, but they are a bit nerfed compared to what they would eventually be, because Last Will in this format still follows the GOAT format ruling, where you have to activate it before a monster is sent from your field to the graveyard before you get to use the effect, right? So later on that changes, and actually very early in the game's history it was also different. But at this time, it does work like it does in GOAT, and that does reduce the consistency of Stein OTK a little bit. I don't think it actually makes too big of a difference, but it can come up at different points, and it does make Stein OTK a little bit more skillful to play, in my opinion, or at least a Stein Monarch deck. I think it is a little bit more skillful than some people give it credit for. And I think that is something that applies throughout all these formats. If you play a deck that's sort of going all in on the Stein OTK stuff, you do have to know when to push your opponent, get aggressive with the Stein OTK combo, or whether to hold back and be like, I can't pay 5,000 life points at this point. I just got to play it safe and bide my time. And, that's part of a reason why you would play one of these formats to, sort of get that dynamic, learn how to play that around that sort of thing. And that can be fun to a lot of people, which is why I'm making this guide in the first place. But I think Cyber format, part of the issue is that not many people play in the tournaments that we've held for it. There is seemingly going to be a bit of a livelier tournament scene. Cyber format has its own Discord server now, which I will link in the description, and we're having our first monthly event there, and it looks like it may be continuing into the future. So if you want to have a format that does have an active tournament scene around this time, Cyber format or Cyber Goat format may be a format for you, and then you can just keep playing events, seeing how the meta develops from that. But part of the issue is that we have not really had super big events so far, and in smaller tournaments, I do think that Stein decks do have a better shot, because Stein decks are inherently, at their core, either you draw a combo or you lose, right? And of course, decks like Stein Monarch can play around that because they can just play the Monarch game plan the entire time and not necessarily need to rely on Stein. But a deck like Monarch is also bricky in its own right. If you draw the Monarchs and not ways to bring them out, then you might lose the game from that, especially if your opponent is playing Stein. And so decks like that can, be a bit hit or miss, right? And if you have a larger tournament, just based on the number of people you got more rounds in that tournament, then over the course of that tournament, while Stein will get lucky, sometimes there will also be rounds where it just hard bricks and loses the game, right? So if you have a huge event for this format, maybe things would turn out differently, and maybe Stein would not be the dominant deck in the format. I think that in none of these formats, Stein is actually tier 0, and that may be a controversial take. I know that a lot of people look at these formats and they're like, Stein OTK, clearly tier 0. I don't necessarily think that's the case. We've seen other decks do well in these tournaments, even in the smaller events, and I do think that just the inherent brickiness occasionally of these decks does make it so that while they are very good and will always be a threat in the format that you have to keep an eye out for, I don't think they'll ever be like tier 0 like you get in other formats with like tier 0 Chaos, like Teledad, etc. It just doesn't have the consistency of those decks, but it can be very, very scary when it does go off, and it sort of looms large in the mind of the player base. And it's always something that you also play around, trying to get your opponent down below that 5,000 life point threshold, no matter what format you're in. But, as I mentioned, Cyber format has not really had many big events, but the next format that I'm going to talk about actually has had some major events, and that is Reaper format. Now, Reaper format was arguably the most popular of these retro formats because this was popularized by MBT and SEMO in the history of Yu-Gi-Oh series. And there was a big Reaper Discord server where you get events upward of 100 people playing. And one of the reasons why people latched onto this format was because it actually used the next ban list, the October 2005 ban list, the one right after GOAT, which hit Pot of Greed, Graceful Charity, Liquid Duo, and BLS. So a lot of the power cards that a lot of people complain about in GOAT format were hit, and they were replaced with some other power cards like Confiscation and Dark Hole, which have their own issues. But because the Trinity was gone, a lot of people latched onto it and were like, okay, well, this is from the same time period of GOAT, so it should probably be more fun now that the power cards are gone. But because those power cards are gone, it does allow for decks like Stein to be a little bit more dominant because, if the overall power level of your average deck is weaker, then that does allow things like Stein to be a bit more dominant. Also, around this time, Last Will changed its ruling, so now you could activate it before or after a monster is sent from field to grave, and Reaper format does play with that ruling, so that means that Stein decks playing Last Will are a bit more powerful here, and Last Will is still at 3 copies, so you have a lot of access to that. But that being said, not every deck wants to play 3 copies of Last Will to go into Stein, so there is a bit of a debate about that. Do I play just 1 copy of Last Will to sack occasionally, or do I go all in on 3? And if I'm going all in on 3, do I want to go more all in on Stein, etc.? And there's a lot of debate in that in sort of deck building and stuff. But as I was mentioning, Reaper format, it did have some major events with a lot of people, and it had a lot of them. It had a fair amount of events in a row. And while Stein OTK was always a deck that showed up in that tournament a lot, like Stein Monarch, etc., decks that were just trying to go for Stein and kill the opponent, oftentimes the decks that won were not Stein OTK. And that was really exciting. Things like Bazoo Return or Warriors would win. And, it shows that in these big events, Stein OTK is not necessarily going to be as big of an issue. Now, that being said, while they may not win events, if you're playing those events, you're going to be playing a lot of Stein OTK players or Stein Monarch players or people just playing Stein in their deck, trying to OTK you in one turn, right? And so that sort of means that the average player experience might not change that much, even if at the top levels of the competitive play in the tournaments, Stein OTK or Stein Monarch is not winning these events. And that being said, there are a lot of fun, more casual decks that do I'm not going to say do well in the events, but you could play them in Reaper format. Things like Dead Rat and Strike Ninja Turbo and stuff. Those were decks that a lot of people really enjoyed and played in those events. And sometimes they would top here and there. But I think as time has gone on and people have learned how to play around these sorts of decks, they have gotten a bit worse, which is a bit unfortunate because they are a lot of fun. But that's just sort of how these formats go. As they get further optimized and further developed, decks sort of fall out of the metagame because people learn how to play around them. They're no longer that surprise element to them. And while they do get optimized more, other decks are also getting optimized more. And the more high-powered decks are getting optimized at a faster rate or at a more efficient rate than these decks. So it's kind of an unfortunate casualty of just the optimization of this format. I think Reaper format is the format that is sort of the most optimized of these formats just because so many people were playing it. That being said, I think there is still a lot of exploration to be done there if you are interested in it. And there is a big Reaper format Discord server, which I will also link in the description down below. If you do want to join in that, see what people are saying about the different decks. And a lot of people have different opinions on the decks in Reaper format. So, don't just take my word for it. See what people want to say because there are a lot of people in that community. And there are still people in the community, even if it doesn't really hold as many tournaments as it once did in the past. Now, I will also say one last thing about Reaper format is that Stallburn is apparently a very good deck in the format. It's won events. Now, it's a bit tricky to evaluate whether that's just on the deck's own merits or just because it's a very tricky deck to play against. And also in smaller events, as I mentioned, Stein OTK or Stein Monarch is sort of boosted by a lower participation rate. So is Stallburn, because if you have less rounds, Stallburn often does win game one because, decks are not prepared for it pre-siding. And then if you've won that game one, you're more likely to win one of game two or three, basically, right? So, I do think this deck has some advantages in a smaller tournament, but it did win in some big events as well. So, this deck still had legs there. But again, is it good? Is it just people don't know how to play around it? I don't quite know. And I think that's still an open question in the format. Either way, you could play stall burn. And I do think that burn is one of the strategies here that could be sort of explored more in the other formats. Because, when you have burn decks and you have Stein that needs to be above 5,000 life points, right? Burn seems like a natural counter to that. So a lot of people don't play burn because they don't like the play style of it. But I do think that burn could be a good deck in a lot of these formats. It's just, again, we haven't had all the events to really see how good it can be. Now, that being said, the next format, Chaos Return, actually did have a, very, very good burn showing in the last event, which was a Dark World burn deck, playing things like gold, along with Dark World Lightning and card destruction, etc., to get the golds and silvers into the graveyard, bring them back for a 2300 hit, and also play things like Dimension Wall or Magic Cylinder to also deal additional burn on top of that. And a more aggro burn deck like that did well there, and maybe this could be ported back into Reaper format. I know a lot of people did experiment with Dark World in Reaper format, but I'm not really sure if they went this direction or other directions, so maybe there's something to experiment with there. But either way, Chaos Return format, which is the next format, actually uses the next ban list, April 2006. And this is the format based around SJC Indianapolis 1 year after GOAT, so August 2006. And a lot of people do like this format. It doesn't really have the large online fan base, but I've seen some very vocal fans of it. And they say it's sort of like the GOAT of, early GX. GOAT is already the GOAT of early GX, but they're like, this is a new renaissance after you get through like Cyber format and Reaper format. And you get like sort of better games, more grindy games, etc., and more interesting decks rise like Dark World. And part of that is because Graceful Charity is now back at 1 copy. For some reason, they were like, this card is fine, let's bring it back. And Graceful Charity, it does increase the power level of your average deck. And it does make things like Chaos a lot better because now you can pitch more fodder for your Chaos monsters. And you can even do the Chaos Return combo that gives the format its name with return from the different dimension and then bring them back. I think with further exploration, people have found like the return stuff is not quite as good as a lot of people, thought it was at the time. So I'm not sure if we should still call it Chaos Return format or if we just change the name to like, SJC Indy 2 Electric Boogaloo or something like that. But I do think that like, there is a lot of different decks that you can play in this format, and a lot of people do really enjoy it. And I think the fact that, a non-Stein deck won in a smaller tournament shows that Stein decks aren't necessarily the only thing running around, and you can play other things like Gold, like Chaos, etc. There's a lot of fun stuff you can do with that. Although, I would say it's just very underexplored, so who knows how it's going to evolve in the future. But I know a lot of people do like this one. If you want to play a format that I'm not sure if it's more balanced than Reaper, but it doesn't have Dark Hole, which is very nice as well. Also, Last Will limited to 1 copy, so that decreases the consistency of Stein decked a little bit. You don't have Stein Monarch having as many access to Last Will as you did in Reaper format. So I do think that, it is a little bit more, grindy overall, but you still do have Stein decks running around, because Stein, throughout all these formats, is at 3 for some reason. I don't know why they kept it at 3 the whole entire time, but you can potentially play a full-on Stein OTK deck, although people haven't really been doing that much. They've just been slotting into Monarchs, because again, as I mentioned, the most annoying part about Stein is that you can slot into any deck. Like the Dark World Burn deck that I mentioned winning the last event also played Stein. The finals were 2 games. It was a 2-0, and each game just boiled down to Stein, right? Even though it's a Dark World deck, it's playing Last Will, it's playing a Stein in the deck, and it's trying to get aggressive with burn damage. So it was able to just bring out Stein both times after it, eaten through the opponent's defenses and just, go for game and win. And that is a factor in the format. It leads to non-games when you have things like that. But even in a format like Chaos Return, which people say is sort of the most balanced of these formats, you do have games like that. And that is the unfortunate price that you pay when you play these formats. But a lot of people do enjoy that sort of thing. So if you do enjoy that sort of thing, try it out. And if you're curious about it, and if you've never played a Stein format, I would recommend playing one of them. I think Chaos Return is maybe the one that, is most open to, new players, because again, a lot of people do view this as a more balanced version of something like Reaper format or even Cyber format, because you don't have Duo and Pot of Greed running around. So I would say, honestly, the one I think people should check out just as probably the most approachable in general is Chaos Return, unless you really, really hate Graceful Charity, because the only one where Graceful Charity is not legal is Reaper format, so you might want to play that instead. But I do think that Chaos Return is a pretty good starting point for a Stein format if you want to get into it. But of course, there's one more Stein format to mention, and that is the one named after Stein itself. That is Stein format. And this is based around SJC San Jose in December of 2006, right before Stein was emergency banned. And the reason why Stein was emergency banned was because at that event, Stein actually won in Top Cut, or basically very, very quickly. It was a very, very quick Top Cut. And that was not deemed to be good by Upper Deck Entertainment. So they're like, we're banning this thing. And, if you look on Dueling Book and you put September 2006, which is the ban list that this format uses, into it, it does have Stein banned here. For Stein format, it's not banned, because this is basically taking the ban from December and retroactively applying it to the September list, which wasn't necessarily the case at the time. So, Stein format is played with Stein at 3 copies. Again, for some reason, they never wanted to limit this card. I don't know why. Last Will is still at 1, though. It does work the way that it does in Reaper, same as in Chaos Return. Graceful Charity is still limited as well. Coffee is still in this format, too. But now Ring is back, so Ring does make it a bit easier to go for more burn damage. It can provide a risk for the Stein OTK player, but a lot of the time, if you're going for an OTK, you can just then set Ring, and then on your opponent's turn, just flip Ring up, pop your own thing, and kill them. So that's a bit scary. It adds to the OTK potential. You also have Double Exiled Force now. It's semi-limited instead of just limited, and that means that, Last Will is turned on more often, and there's more removal as well. So this does lead to Stein being a little bit better in this format than in the past, and it also does lead to people playing more just, focused Stein OTK decks. Now, they could have been playing these in previous formats, not really much has changed. They play Triple Poison the Old Man, they play Megamorphs, they play Mangas to boost up their life points in deck thin and things like that. Nothing stopped them from playing that in Chaos Return or in Reaper format. But because the original Stein format event was won by an all-in Stein OTK deck, I think that leads to more people experimenting with it in Stein format. And also, again, because Ring exists and things like that, I think that people do lean more heavily into this strategy and play it a lot more. But I do think there is room for experimentation here. We're having a Stein format tournament later in this month, in August 2024, just to date the video. And who knows what's going to win that? It might be full-on Stein OTK. It could be something like Dark World Burn, which, didn't really lose anything going into Stein format. It could even be a different deck entirely, like, Chain Burn. Chain Burn is legal now because Cyber-Deck Impact came out. I personally think chain burn is pretty bad. A lot of people view it as like, hey, that's a good counter to Stein because you get them down below 5,000 quickly. But it's just there's too many things that counter you post siding. So I don't think chain burn is really that good. And again, as I mentioned with Stein, a lot of decks are just playing it as a package, right? And, you can just take out that package if you're worried about chain burn games 2 and 3 and just do your general game plan. So I don't think that chain burn's that good, but it is something that people can play as a potential counter. And again, it's another burn strategy. So I think burn is sort of situated well in all these formats. You also have fun stuff you can do with like Future Fusion and Overload Fusion along with Chimera Tech Overdragon. You can play that if you want. Although, if you want to play that, you should really play in the next format, Chimera Tech format, which does not have Stein, and which I am covering currently on the channel as well. So if you want to see more videos about that, definitely subscribe to the channel so that way you'll stay up to date on those. But, I'm just saying that there's a lot more things that you can do in Stein format. But unfortunately, just like in all the previous formats, Stein OTK is sort of the, hurdle that all rogue decks have to sort of jump over to actually, be able to be played in the format. Because no one wants to just instant lose to a Stein deck. And oftentimes, even the best decks can't help that. But if you're playing a, subpar deck, you're much, much more likely to just not be able to get your opponent down below that 5,000 life point threshold or mount enough of a defense and just give your opponent enough time to actually assemble a Stein OTK, which you don't want to do. Now, I will say one other counter in this format is Vanity's Fiend. That is now out. And when Vanity's Fiend's on the field, your opponent can't Cyber-Stein stuff, so that's kind of nice. But the issue with Vanity's Fiend is that, it is basically a Monarch, right? The deck that would want to play this is Monarchs, and Monarchs already have access to Stein. So, it's just cementing Monarchs as sort of a better deck in the format as well. And Monarchs is going to be a deck in all these formats as well. It's very, very good at getting out Stein and just being a threat on its own because 2400 attack is pretty big if you can just keep bringing out big tribute monsters that can kill your opponent on its own. So Monarchs is going to be a good strategy in all these formats, which is kind of why I didn't mention it because, I don't think Monarchs itself changes from format to format really. But I do think, it's something that you'll have to keep in mind for all these formats. I've been more focusing on the differences, but that they do often feel very similar, right? That is sort of the biggest issue with this set of formats is that, they are all very similar, even though they do have their differences that I've highlighted here. So if you do want to play one of them, hopefully this did help you decide which one to do. But also know that, if you played one of them and you're like, I didn't really like that, jumping into another one might not necessarily change your opinion on this time period, right? This time period is definitely not the best one in Yu-Gi-Oh's history. Again, it will have its fans. Every format can have its fans that do enjoy it. But I do think that, this is alienating to a lot of people in the player base, unfortunately. Mainly, unfortunately, because we have this time period in Yu-Gi-Oh's history where it's just, format after format after format that, people do not enjoy. I'm kind of surprised the game survived this long. Given this stretch of formats like this. But I do think that, even though it can be unpleasant to play at times, it is worth occasionally going back and playing these formats and seeing, what you can enjoy. And hopefully this sort of laid out the main differences between them. One last difference is that Stein format, Chaos Sorcerer is banned now, so you don't have Chaos, which sort of cements Stein as an even better deck in the format, but it is another difference if you don't want to be playing around with Chaos in that format. So that's probably the last difference between Stein and the other formats, I'd say. But just to sort of summarize, the differences that I mentioned, TLDW, although if you made it this far, you probably have watched all the way. Cyber format is basically GOAT format, both Stein OTK added to the mix. Reaper format is basically, no Trinity, sure, but it's arguably Stein at its most powerful because you have triple last will that does work the best way it does. So, this is sort of the highest impact that Stein has, I would say, potentially, outside of maybe Stein format itself. Chaos Return is probably the most approachable of these formats to just someone wanting to dip their toes into one of them because you have a large variety of decks that you can play, even though Stein is sort of a meta warping card in all of them. But, Chaos Return's probably the one. If you want to try out one, try out this one. And then Stein format is sort of when Stein reaches its second peak after Reaper format and Chaos is gone. So this deck is really, really cemented at the top of the metagame. So hopefully that helped you decide which one you'd want to play if you do want to play one. And hopefully you enjoyed this sort of rambling discussion. If you want to see more discussion videos like this in the future, definitely let me know. I mean, I'm making this video because it was a recommendation from, one of my commenters or someone on the Discord. I forget which one. But, they said you should do a video going through all the different Stein formats and, ranking them or, talking about the differences. And I agree. I think that's a very good video, so hopefully this was helpful for you. And if you want to see more coverage of these formats, I do have a bunch of videos showing off gameplay in them. If you want to see deck lists as well, those are in those videos too. So hopefully that can help you dive into them even more. But I hope you enjoyed this video as always. Let me know what you think of these formats down in the comments below, and also leave a like if you liked the video. And as always, I got to shout out my patrons. So big shout outs to GeoMyFest, Rinswin, Porktuckin, Bren Donker, Dump Truck, and Tyler Compton. It means a lot that you all support me this way, encouraging me to make more videos like this in the future. But if you want to play any of these formats, definitely check out the Yugioh from Zero Discord server down in the comments below, or not the comments, but the description below. And, you know, there's no current Chaos Return format server. There is a Stein format server, so I'll actually add that to the description as well. But yeah, Chaos Return is the only one without a Discord server. Maybe someone will make one. If they do, I'll update the description, add that down below. But as of now, all we've got is Cyber, Reaper, and Stein for the Discord servers devoted to the format specifically. But if you want to check out any of them, definitely check out those too. But I hope you enjoyed this as always. And until next time, I've been Ben from Yugioh from Zero. I'm signing off.